Hello again, my name is Tom Nelson, and this is a continuation of the Diabetes Control course. This is step number 5, diabetic weight loss. It's step 5 of the 6 steps in gaining complete control over your diabetes. This is video lesson number 11, part 2, how your body manages fat. So where does fat that is stored in the fat cells come from? Your liver has dedicated vessels that lead directly to that adipose fat layer, the outside, the visceral fat, that enables your liver to deposit fat and to reclaim it if needed for energy. But it's your liver that is going to deliver it to those fat cells. And it's a direct connection by vessels, blood vessels, that is going to do it. But the liver can easily draw fat from that storage in those adipose fat cells whenever it's going to be needed to keep your cells functioning, to provide fuel for those cells whenever glucose is not available. So fat cells, when stimulated by insulin, are capable of absorbing and converting glucose and amino acids that remain in the bloodstream after a meal into fat. We've talked about that in previous videos, that if you eat too much, you eat the wrong things, too many carbs, all of those things can produce large amounts of fats. Whatever your cells can't uptake in terms of glucose is going to be converted and stored as fat. So the conversion of carbohydrates and protein into fat is not a very efficient process. In fact, 10 times less efficient than a direct deposit of triglycerides. The fat cell only needs to expend 2.5 calories of energy in order to store 100 calories of fat or triglycerides. But it requires 23 calories of energy to convert the excess glucose into fat and store it. But don't think that's going to stop it. It will. If there's excess glucose in your bloodstream, it's going to be converted to fat and stored. So the fat cells will choose the easier path if they have a choice over the more difficult. But when you're not eating or eating less, if you aren't getting enough carbohydrates in your diet, if you're on a diet or fasting, then your body's not going to produce the amount of glucose that is going to be needed to provide for the energy requirements of all the cells. So your body's not going to be absorbing glucose. Another cause is insulin resistance. So there's very little insulin released into the bloodstream when you're not eating or when you're cutting back significantly on what you do eat. And insulin is going to be released in proportion to the amount of glucose that's present in your bloodstream. So this is a key concept. Understand it. If to understand weight loss, you have to understand where the fat comes from. So your body is still using fuel from other sources in order to produce heat and energy to keep your cells alive and functioning, like proteins and fats, for example. So those fats will come from the stored fat in the fat cells whenever there's not enough glucose in the bloodstream. So under those circumstances, a number of hormones will be produced and released by your body's vital organs. The pancreas will produce the hormone glucagon, which is the opposite of insulin. Insulin is a storage hormone. Glucagon is a glucose-increasing hormone. So glucagon will seek to increase the amount of glucose and or fuel in the bloodstream. Glucagon will trigger your liver to release stored glycogen. Remember, glycogen is glucose in a compact stored form. Whenever the cells take up glucose, they enter enzymes, convert it into glycogen, which is a very compact form of glucose. And so whenever glucagon triggers the liver to release glucose, it's going to convert that glycogen back into glucose and then release it into the bloodstream. And it'll also trigger your fat cells to release fatty acids. That means enzymes are going to disassemble those triglycerides that are stored and release each of those individual strands of fat into the bloodstream so that the cells can uptake them and use them as fuel. So glucagon works in opposition to insulin, and it produces the opposite effect. Glucagon raises your blood sugar, it shifts the metabolism into a burning mode, and it converts proteins and fat into glucose. But again, it's also necessary in order for the fat cells to release fat so that it can be burned. So glucagon causes stored fat to be burned as fuel. It'll produce heat and it'll produce energy. It's not as efficient as glucose, but your cells will use it when they have to. Glucagon also releases fat from the fat cells. It reduces cholesterol production. It causes your kidneys to release water from the body. It causes the artery wall cells to return to normal. It's a very important hormone. And by cutting back on what you eat and how much you eat and eating the right kinds of things, you're going to promote less insulin production and more glucagon production. So the adrenal gland is going to produce and release epinephrine. Epinephrine is just a scientific name for adrenaline, which will also signal your liver to release stored glucose. So the thyroid gland is going to maintain enough of the T3 and T4 hormones to ensure that the mitochondria, the power plants in your cells, can produce enough energy and heat to keep your body going. You recall from earlier videos that the thyroid hormone, T3, is the hormone that enters your power plants inside all 37 trillion of your body cells, and it lights the fire in the power plant that actually produces the heat and the energy. So it's extremely important. Now, the pituitary gland, which is controlled by the hypothalamus, your control room, you remember also that your hypothalamus is a very small organ right in the center of your brain that controls over 25,000 different functions throughout your body simultaneously. That hypothalamus is going to control the pituitary gland and the function of several other endocrine glands called the master gland. So it secretes what's called the ACTH, which stimulates the pituitary gland to produce and release epinephrine and cortisol. Cortisol is a stress-related hormone. Both of those will increase the amount of blood sugar that's in your bloodstream. So those hormones act on the muscle cells, the fat tissue, and the liver cells and produce the opposite effects of insulin. Insulin promotes the removal of glucose. Those hormones promote the increase in glucose. So it's a multi-step process known as gluconeogenesis. It'll break down fatty acids for use as fuel, or it will convert amino acids into glucose. Proteins are made primarily of amino acids, and about half of the amino acids that are used to manufacture meat tissue are capable of being converted directly into glucose. So earlier, several enzymes, which are activated by hormones, like glucagon, epinephrine, and growth hormones, all are discussed that break down triglycerides into fatty acids and glycerol, so that those fatty acid individual strands can be picked up by the cells and used for fuel. So these fatty acids and glycerol travel to the liver in the bloodstream, and they can be broken down further to make glucose if necessary. So weight loss can only be accomplished by burning the stored fat, which will only happen if the volume of carbohydrates and fats in the diet are significantly reduced. You'll learn also that your body can remove fat if it's exposed to excess oxygen in your bloodstream, which means that through exercise you can actually burn more fat than what your cells will burn. So it causes the minimization of insulin in the bloodstream and the maximization of the fat-releasing hormones, like glucagon, epinephrine, and growth hormones. So as the volume of stored fat is reduced in the fat cells, those fat cells are going to shrink in size, and you will lose weight. Eating a balanced diet, cutting the carbohydrate and unhealthy fats significantly, and exercising will make that happen. So now go to video lesson number 11, step 5 of 6, part 3. We're going to talk about visceral fat. Thank you for watching, and please pay it forward.